Good morning.
Good morning.
When Katie asked me if I would be willing to talk about a movie that informed my faith, my first thoughts were how to turn the Christmas holiday flick Love Actually, or the 2015 version of Far From the Madding Crowd, the only film I confess to watching 4 times in 10 days on that big screen. Or any flick with Colin Firth in it to a faith-based movie. Even though Colin Firth appears in Love Actually, I could not make that movie work for today's message. So I'm grateful Katie highlighted the King's Speech, starring him in the first sermon in this series. It's a great film, and so are Love Actually and the latest version of Far From the Madding Crowd. My sister Carolyn, trying to be helpful, suggested I talk about one of her favorite films, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which spins the hilarious adventures of 2 very different businessmen trying to get home for the holidays by any means imaginable. In so doing, they learn to appreciate their differences, share what they have in common, and care about the other. It's another great film, but for another sermon series. And it's fictional, unless you found yourself on a long trip with someone whose company drives you crazy, in which case you probably think the movie is based on a true story and some form of social justice should prevail. Several friends recommended Shawshank Redemption, which was tempting, as it's another great film, though again fictional, that deals with wrongful incarceration. More significantly for me, it was filmed at the Mansfield Reformatory in Ohio, where my father and grandfather both taught, and one of the local townspeople cast for the jury in the opening scene of the film was a woman my uncle dated when they were in high school. And there's The Green Mile, which also deals with prisons and wrongful incarceration of a gentle giant of a man, but it's fictional too. Alas, my list of compelling films could go on and on, but that's not the topic I'm charged with this morning. For today's message, I elected to turn to movies that over the years have deepened my knowledge and understanding of real events and the real-life people who, against unfathomable odds, shape those events. Individuals who turn large and small wheels of justice for good. Great movies put me into worlds very different from my own. And once experienced, I leave the theater changed. This morning, I want to highlight some movies that put a camera up against not only the people, cultures, and systems perpetuating injustice, intolerance, greed, and hatred, but also captured on film the immense capacity, sheer tenacity, and mind-blowing courage of individuals to stand up for something better for themselves, their families, their communities, their world. You'll find those I mentioned today on a handout inside your bulletin packet. And I invite you to think about films that have changed you too. My maternal great-grandfather worked in the coal mines of western Pennsylvania in his early adult years. I knew such work was difficult and dangerous, but not until I saw the 2 documentary dramas, Harlan County, USA, and Mayflower in the 1970s and 1980s, respectively, could I truly imagine the brutality of work below ground, the rapacious nature of many mine companies to profit from the labor of men like my great-grandfather, and their murderous, villainous response to union organizing and labor resistance. Such stories were never told in my Ohio history book. on a true story, the film features a textile worker who decides finally to stop sewing and literally stand on her work table holding aloft a sign with the single word, union. One by one, her co-workers turn off their machines too and stop working. Her fight for better working conditions through collective action changed the industry. And who can forget the true life story told in the movie Erin Brockovich, released in 2000, featuring an unemployed single mother of 3 who, having lost a personal injury lawsuit herself, pleads for a job at a law firm. While reviewing some files on a case, she comes across medical records associated with real estate transactions that lead her to unsettling interviews with homeowners and eventually to damning evidence that Pacific Gas and Electric is systematically covering up its industrial poisoning of a city's water supply. Erin Brockovich knew something was terribly wrong, and despite her lack of formal credentials, she did not stop until PG&E was stopped. The result? The largest settlement at that time in a direct action lawsuit. Another favorite film of mine, set in San Francisco, tells the story of Christopher Gardner, whose world collapses around him as his fledgling business fails. His wife leaves him, and he is evicted from his apartment and lands in jail for unpaid parking tickets the night before a critical interview for one of 20 coveted unpaid internships with Dean Witter. Homeless and nearly penniless, in one riveting scene, Chris cradles his young son in a train station restroom where they are forced to spend the night. The Pursuit of Happiness chronicles Gardner's Herculean efforts during the day to impress his supervisors at Dean Witter that he has the talent to succeed in the high-stakes world of financial investment, while he fights for space every night at a homeless shelter sponsored by Glide Memorial United Methodist Church. Despite the odds stacked against him, he never loses his sense of personal worth or his priorities to ensure his child's welfare. For 6 months, he hides his situation from the Dean Witter staff and ultimately wins the prized full-time job at the firm. The end credits tell us that Chris Gardner eventually leaves Dean Witter to launch his own highly successful brokerage firm. In the early 1990s, I lost a good friend and colleague to the ravages of AIDS. He was bright, kind, thoughtful, and so lonely for intimacy that he entered recklessly into relationships that resulted in a disease that took his life. Shortly after Ron's death, the movie Philadelphia premiered, one of the first treatments by Hollywood of AIDS, homosexuality, and homophobia. It is inspired by the true story of a young, brilliant attorney who contracts AIDS and loses his job because of it. Ultimately, he wins a massive wrongful termination suit against a major multinational law firm, but he dies near the end of the trial. I wept at the end of the film, not only for the main character, but for Ron and for all those lost to AIDS, many of whom had spent their entire lives in hiding because of intolerance and bigotry. In 2008, 15 years after seeing Philadelphia, on a visit to my father in Maine, I convinced him to see the just-released film Milk, although I was unsure of how he would react to it. My father loved going to movies whenever he could, but after seeing a film he did not especially like, he would often say, "Well, it's not as good as From Here to Eternity." Milk tells the true story of Harvey Milk, a gay rights activist in San tragically in White's shooting Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Milk in their offices at City Hall. The murders shocked the country. The movie ends with documentary footage of thousands marching with candles lighted to City Hall to pay tribute to Milk and his fight to change the world. Dad and I left the cinema in silence, knowing we had witnessed on screen a life wrongfully destroyed by hate. Earlier this month, the British government unveiled a new coin to honor mathematical genius Alan Turing, whose life story is told in the riveting 2014 film, The Imitation Game. As noted in The Independent this month, Turing was one of the most gifted scientists, mathematicians, and thinkers of his or any other age. Among his achievements were developing the theoretical underpinnings of the world's first computers and laying the groundwork for the development of artificial intelligence. His most famous work, cracking the fiendishly complex Nazi Enigma code during the Second World War, is said to not only have turned the conflict in favor of the Allies, but done so with such significance that it shortened the whole thing by several years. Some military historians estimate Turing's genius saved as many as 2 million lives. But for any of us who do not know his full story, the endnotes of this movie are as painful as the preceding scenes triumphant. Turing was convicted for gross indecency in the early 1950s and chose chemical castration over a jail sentence. He committed suicide in 1954 at age 41. The Queen granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon in 2003. And the British 50-pound note now features him. The Great Debaters, released in 2007, tells the true story of debate coach Melvin B. Tolson, who fought to place his debate team from Wiley College, an historically black college related to the Methodist Episcopal Church, on equal footing with white schools in the American South during the 1930s. The film recounts the Tolson's fierce preparation of his team, their harrowing travels to matches at all white colleges across the Jim Crow South, including a near encounter with a lynch mob, and their rise to the national championship debate against Harvard. In truth, they faced off against USC, but one of the lines of dialogue used several times is a famous paraphrase of Augustine of Hippo. An unjust law is no law at all. The movie Loving, which came out in 2016, tells the true story of Richard and Mildred Loving, who as an interracial couple were not allowed by law to marry in the state of Virginia. Their arrest and subsequent legal battles undertaken by the ACLU eventually led to the 1967 Supreme Court decision striking down the country's last segregation laws regarding interracial marriage. If you did not see it, I encourage you to rent the 2018 biopic On the Basis of Sex, which tells the story of sex discrimination barriers Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to overcome in law school and early in her career, and her tenacious legal fights and courtroom victories for gender equality in the workplace. We celebrated the 50th anniversary this month of man's first landing on the moon, and those of us alive in 1969 will never forget where we were when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface. But if you saw the 2016 movie Hidden Figures, you, like I, learned for the first time about the African American women who, despite the racial and sexual discrimination they faced in getting an education and achieving in the workplace, brought their mathematical to the early years of the NASA space program. In the film, you watch the orbiting John Glenn insist that the white men in the control room use the trajectory calculations made by one of those black women, Katherine Johnson, over their own, thereby guaranteeing Glenn's safe return to Earth. The 2014 Selma, the movie Selma, records through documentary footage and vivid reenactment the frightening tensions, arrests, bloodshed, and murder that preceded the historic 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery by those advocating for equal voting rights for blacks in America. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., President Lyndon Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, now Congressman John Lewis, and other key figures of the time are portrayed in Selma. King pressed that the Selma to Montgomery voting rights march remain nonviolent for maximum impact, but did not join it initially, knowing that his very presence could provoke violence. The History Channel noted, "The marchers didn't get far before Alabama state troopers wielding whips, nightsticks, and tear gas rushed the group at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back to Selma. The brutal scene was captured on television, enraging many Americans and drawing civil rights and religious leaders of all faiths to Selma in protest. Hundreds of ministers, priests, rabbis, and social activists soon headed to Selma to join the voting rights march. As the world watched, the protesters, under the protection of federalized National Guard troops, finally achieved their goal, walking around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery. The historic march and Martin Luther King's participation in it raised awareness of the difficulties faced by black voters and the need for a national Voting Rights Act. The movie Selma tells that story on the big screen. President Johnson signed the landmark civil rights legislation into law in 1965. There can be no more scarring but life-altering film to watch than the 1993 Schindler's List. It tells the story of industrialist Oskar Schindler, who becomes an unlikely humanitarian when he fights to save his Jewish factory workers in Krakow, Poland, from the gas chambers in the nearby Auschwitz concentration camps. Through bribery of Nazi officials and incalculable courage, Schindler manages to save more than 1,100 Polish Jews from almost certain death in the Holocaust. When Schindler must flee for his own safety, his Jewish workers give him a ring engraved with the Talmudic quotation, "He who saves the world, the life of one man, saves the world entire." I have never left a theater so filled with raw emotion that after seeing Schindler's List, and while I've never forgotten it, I've never been able to watch it again. That said, I have walked through his factory in Krakow, which is now a museum, and walked the hallowed grounds of Auschwitz, both places silent testimonials to the brutality of some and the incalculable courage of Oskar Schindler and many others. The last film on my list of great films, and the only sports movie on my list, is Invictus, released in 2009. I've spoken of this film several times in past remarks to you, but I hope you'll indulge me again and see this movie if you haven't. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years by the apartheid government of South Africa, most of that time at hard labor on Robben Island. In prison, Mandela never surrendered his dignity, nor his willingness to see his captors as individual human beings. Upon his release, He was elected the country's first black president in 1994. As the Associated Press noted on the death of Mr. Mandela in December 2013, as head of state, the former boxer, lawyer, and inmate lunched with a prosecutor who argued successfully for his incarceration. He sang the apartheid-era Afrikaans anthem at his inauguration and traveled hundreds of miles to have tea with the widow of the prime minister in power at the time he was sent to prison. One of the most memorable of his gestures toward racial harmony was the day in 1995 when he strode onto the field before the Rugby World Cup final in Johannesburg, and then again after the game when he congratulated the home team for its victory over New Zealand. It was typical of Mr. Mandela to march headlong into the bastion of white African Arabdom, in this case the Temple of South African Rugby, and make its followers feel they belonged in the new South Africa. That event was vividly portrayed in the film Invictus. The film title is also the title of a poem by Ernest Henley that Nelson Mandela recited over and over again within the walls of his prison cell. Its final verse reads, "It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." When I watch films like Harlan County, USA, or On the Basis of Sex, Erin Brockovich, or Philadelphia, Norma Ray, or Milk, Loving, or Selma, Hidden Figures, or The Imitation Game, The Pursuit of Happiness, or The Great Debaters, Schindler's List, or Invictus, I leave the cinema changed. I exit the movie house reminded that individuals alone stood up to systems that were wrong. They risked their livelihoods and lives doing so. Whether or not they were driven by faith, the men and women whose lives are illuminated on the big screen in my favorite films responded boldly to evil in their worlds and changed them for good. They spoke out, often at their own peril, for human rights and dignity, freedom and justice. They asked to be counted, and others like them to be counted as well, regardless of their gender, race, religion, economic status, sexual orientation, or any other arbitrary and senseless marker. Several years ago, my friend Lee said something during a dinner gathering at my home that I've never forgotten. He remarked, "When all is said and done, Jesus was really an insurrectionist." I could not agree more. Jesus made the Roman authorities and the Jewish hierarchy very nervous. He assembled humble, unremarkable disciples and called on them to give away everything and join him in something profoundly more important than their daily pursuits. Sadly, we have no film footage, only Bible stories, to document his time on this earth. But his life and the lessons he taught are Oscar-worthy material. When Jesus saw injustice, he acted and asked others to do the same. He upended the tables of the money changers in the temple. He performed miracles for the sick and lame and blind. He ate with tax collectors and befriended prostitutes. He sought out the marginalized and broken, and he commanded his followers to love and care for them and for each other. Jesus recognized gifts in everyone, regardless of their standing in society or how grand their house was, or if they had a home at all. He gathered crowds and asked for adherence to higher authority. He sparked a march into Jerusalem, and the crowds gathered and sang hosannas. He was willing to die for us, and he did. God calls us to live our faith in real time. rights to live safe, full, healthy, independent lives. God calls us, as he surely called Aaron Brockovich, Harvey Milk, Alan Turing, Oscar Schindler, and Nelson Mandela, to acts of insurrection and resistance. He implores each of us to respond boldly and loudly, using the gifts he has so liberally bestowed on us. He asks us to step outside the comfort of our air-conditioned movie houses and onto the streets. He calls us to be more than spectators. When called, will we use our voices, our votes, our time and treasure to speak out when we see injustice and mistreatment and bigotry? Will we fight for clean drinking water and breathable air for every neighborhood, not just our own? Will we demand this nation ensure safe haven for those fleeing oppression and violence, and work with other nations to end the oppression and violence that give mothers and fathers no choice but to flee? Will we truly love one another as Jesus taught us to love? We live on a huge movie set called Planet Earth. When the stories of our lives and deeds unfold on the proverbial silver screens watched by future generations, how will the credits roll? I wonder, will anyone leave the theater changed?